Let's talk.
Giles Brown.
British Comics, A Cultural History, now available in paperback. This book examines comic publishing and reading in Britain from the late Victorian era to the present. I am delighted to be joined by cultural historian James Chapman. James, good morning to you.
Good morning, Giles, and thank you for inviting me on the show.
Pleasure's all mine. My little eyes lit up with glee when this one landed across my desk because I was like, comics. And if you are a child of the 70s, then it was something of a golden era. The 50s, the 60s, and the 70s and even the early 80s are something of a golden period for the comic, especially the British comic. What makes a British comic so different, do you think?
Well, I grew up reading comics, and like a lot of, I think, British children of my generation, I had access to American comics and British comics, and I developed a preference for the British product. I don't know that was a conscious thing when I was young, but I think British comics, whilst sharing a lot of common characteristics with their American counterparts, do nevertheless have a different character and style of their own, and they follow a different historical trajectory.
I mean, let's talk about, if you like, because comics originate in the Victorian period. Where do comics come from? Because we're not talking, you know, a single picture like the Giles cartoons in the Express in the 50s or whatever. And we're not talking sort of Punch, are we, or something like that. So what is the definition of a comic? And because there are comic books and a British comic book is different from American comic book. So explain to me a little bit about if you like, as they say in the Marvel universe, the origin story, I suppose.
Yes, well, as you rightly mentioned, I mean, the comics emerge in Britain in the late Victorian period, and there's a whole cluster, I think, of historical and cultural reasons that come together. You have the Education Act in 1870, which creates a new generation of literate working class children. You have the emergence of a leisure economy. More people have disposable income, even in relatively, children in relatively less well-off communities. And comics are very cheap, popular culture. And you also have developments in the emergence of the mass readership popular press, famously with the Daily Mail. But around that, the press publishers are pioneering titles for amusement, initially for the amusement of adults, but they find that some of these are also read by children. Often you have a combination of prose material, stories, poems and so on, but also of picture strips. And it was these picture strips which in the early days were what we call funnies. They would be slapstick adventures, often of tramps and working class characters who are the butt of humour, and they seem to be particularly popular, and so the picture strip paper developed as a consequence. It's important, I think, to emphasise that when we talk about British comics, we tend to think of the correct name for them is papers. They would be papers for juveniles, for adolescents, but they would contain a number of separate strips of separate stories, which is distinct from the American comic book, which emerges in the 1930s. Your detective comics, action comics, which is the origin of Superman and so on, which tended to be longer form stories, but with one standalone story per issue.
And these are things that they are series, aren't they? So they're always going to leave with a cliffhanger, so that you go out and you buy the following. I mean, other majorities of British comics, are they weeklies? Are they monthlies? I mean, is it? There's no one size fits all. I suppose it just depends on the readership and how well they were doing. Yeah,
in the heyday of comics, mid to late 20th century, most of the major titles were weeklies.
Right.
You would have some that were less frequent, some of the so-called picture libraries, which were more in the American style. These emerged in the 1950s, and they might have been more sort of monthly, longer installment, single-story comics. But by and large, your major titles, Eagle, Girl, Victor, Warlord, which is a particular favourite of mine, they were weekly titles.
It's interesting as well because, especially in the British comic thing, we mentioned, Eagle and Warlord and that sort of thing, and then you have comics such as, I don't know, Dandy and Beano, which are slightly more. Are they aimed at the younger audience? Aren't they? So there's a sort of split where you get this sort of because both are serious works of the people who are putting them together. But I suppose a Beano is aimed at the younger reader rather than something a little bit more with some sort of more meaty or even violent content, I suppose we'd call it now. With especially when you get to sort of warrior comics and that sort of stuff. Warlord.
Mm. Well, yes, I mean, Dandy and Beano, which are titles that started in the 1930s, and they were very much in the tradition of early comics, such as Comic Cuts. So they were aimed at particularly younger readers, maybe typically a sort of 7 to 10-year-old age group, and they were funny, humorous stories. Often, sometimes with a slightly subversive edge. The Beano in particular was, all about, or it seems to me to be all about subverting adult authority and so on. Although Denison may sort of gets slippered in the end, we wouldn't allow that these days.
Exactly.
I think there's a difference between those comics and then, say, comics which are perhaps more for an adolescent readership, a sort of 11 to 15-year-old, which are the adventure papers, adventure strips. You mentioned Eagle, which launched in 1950 and was really the premier British weekly comic of the 1950s.
Now, this is interesting because you've got the 30s and the build-up and you've got comics coming out then, and then we have the horrors of the Second World War and austerity in the UK, and then Eagle launches in the 50s, and I think it's really interesting as a cultural historian. I think this is brilliant. You picked this up, James, because there is, after what Europe's or everybody's been through, you need, if you like, something that points to a brighter future, and something like the Eagle for adolescents is basically is pointing to a better world. We're talking the atom age, we're talking rocket ships, we're talking there is a bright look to the future in the Eagle that is, if you like, a salve to a population or a young population that's trying to make sense of pretty much what they've been through.
Yes, that's very much the case. The Eagle launched in 1950, and it's just on that cusp of Britain emerging from wartime and post-war austerity, moving into the 1950s, which becomes an era of relative affluence for a larger section of the population. The Eagle was revolutionary as a comic. It was a larger size, and it was used photogravure colour. There were colour comics in Britain before this, but they tended to be a very insipid sort of two-tone colour. But Eagle was vibrant. It was used a full colour template. And in the title strip, Dan Dare, Pilot of the Future, brilliantly drawn by the artist Frank Hampson, there was a sense of a kind of futuristic modernity. This was a forward-looking ethos of Britain moving into the space age, moving into an age of greater egalitarianism, although the comic itself is still quite rigid, I think, in what it's saying about race and gender relations. But a sort of futuristic technological utopia, which seems to have chimed with that era. Remember, 1951, we have the Festival of Britain, which is a celebration of British engineering and scientific achievement. 1953, we have the coronation of Elizabeth II, and there's almost a sense of the eagle is part of this new Elizabethan age of renewal and exploration and discovery, and it also strong moral sense.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's all right. I came in there. Yeah, there's a moral thing to it. I'm just thinking because it's that, the Festival of Britain, the new Elizabethan age, and also, of course, 52, we got Sputnik. So suddenly space opens up, and it's the jet age, and it's the atomic age, because obviously we don't know at that point, some of the things that are coming out of the atomic age, if you like. But there is that bright, clear future, and it's an interesting point that it's almost just Britain's going to be leading the way, but some of the class structures and the inherent, shall we say, slightly dodgy theories about race and the empire are sort of transported into this forward-looking Britain.
Yes, I mean, the Eagle was founded and edited by the Reverend Marcus Morris, who was a Church of England clergyman, and he launched the comic because he'd seen some of the imported American comic books, which children in his parish had been reading, and this was a time of a moral panic around so-called horror comics. These were British reprints of American titles such as Vault of Fear, and Vault of Terror and so on. And they were seen as being quite violent, as being very dark in their content, and as being a corrupting influence on juveniles. Interestingly, the comics themselves have been reclaimed by cultural historians of being sort of anti-McCarthyite, quite progressive in their politics in certain ways, but that wasn't really picked up at the time. But there's this fear around the corrupting influence of comics. We see it historically around new forms of popular culture. We've seen it more recently around video games, around rap music and so on. The idea that you play Grand Theft Auto, you're going to go off and become a McCarthy. And so there's this real anxiety that children were having, if you like, unmediated access to this content. So Reverend Marcus Morris launched the Eagle as a wholesome alternative. It would have exciting stories. There will be action. There isn't what we would consider gratuitous violence. But there's also a strong moral message. There's a Christian, worldview and ethos that comes out of the Eagle. The letters pages are very interesting. They would promote what was known as the Mug of the Week competition, which was actually stories about children doing good deeds. And as social documents, they're fascinating. Some of the letters you read about, this is the early 1950s, but you read about, sort of perhaps 12, 14-year-old children who might be acting as primary carers for parents or for brothers, often who sustained injuries during the war, and then they provide an insight, I think, into the social life and social fabric of Britain at the time.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because obviously in the States you've got that whole B-movie culture. And for a clergyman in the UK, in the home counties, something like The Creature from the Black Lagoon must have been absolutely terrifying and awful, and the schlock movies. So this was seen as a way of fighting about that. And yes, I mean, again, it is because the echoes of the Second World War go down, continue. So it doesn't exist in a vacuum. So you have, people who are caring for brothers or family members who have been wounded. Absolutely fascinating. And you wouldn't think to look in a comic that they would have that, but again, cultural history. You will find gems in the most unusual places. And I suppose it also brings in that whole moral thing, because things like the Scout movement and the Girl Guides, and these are seen as, putting back into your society in a wholesome way. And people might sneer at it, but I mean, this was a real thing.
They're very much the products of their time. And one of the things that fascinates me as a cultural historian is whether we see the comics like The Eagle, and its sister paper, Girl. There's an interesting story about that. Right. You had quite a lot of letters from boys saying, my sister steals my Eagle comic before I can get my hands on it when it arrives. And so they launched a paper specifically aimed at girls. It's called Girl, which is a lot of school stories and so on. And there's quite evidence that boys enjoyed reading it as well. But yet, one of the things that fascinates me is whether we regard these comics as it were, reflections of, a bygone age, of the kind of social values and mores and attitudes of Britain in the 1950s, or whether we see them as part of that process, as consciously promoting a particular ethos and a particular worldview. And I think in the case of the Eagle, there's a lot of evidence that it was looking to promote consensual, broad-based consensual post-war welfare state, but still invested in the idea of empire consensus politics.
Fascinating. Also, the thing is, because this is a really thorny one later on, when you get action comics coming out that handle the Second World War, and we're talking they're coming out 50, less than 20 years since the end of the war. So this has to be handled, I suppose, in a certain kind of way, which must have been a really interesting sort of dilemma for the people who were putting Warlord or Warrior together.
Well, the war and the Second World War in particular becomes perhaps the dominant genre in British comics from round about the mid-late 1950s. First of all, you have picture strips appearing in comics such as Lion and Valiant, but then you have the dedicated war comics, Commando, War Picture Library, and then coming through into the 1970s, Warlord and Battle, solely about war stories. There's a particular narrative that emerges. British comics are telling the British narrative of the Second World War. The Americans are a relatively peripheral presence. You will hardly ever come across a reference to the Soviet Union at all. This, of course, was the era of the Cold War.
Sure.
There's a grudging acceptance, perhaps, of the French as allies. There's an acknowledgement, I think, of the role of the British Empire and Commonwealth, and often, particularly the white Commonwealth. You often have tough, hard-bitten Australian, and Kiwi protagonists in there.
Yeah.
But it's a narrative. This is also an era when cinema is saturated with war movies as well. You know, the Dam Busters, Dunkirk, the Guns of Navarone. It's that sort of era. But in the comics, there's more of an emphasis on working class protagonists. You don't get many comics which are actually about the officer and gentleman stereotype, which is still persisting in some British films. Typically, the hero of a comic is a war story, is a hard-bitten non-commissioned officer, or if he is an officer, he's invariably one who's risen through the ranks. And this is comics, I think, responding to, post-war social change, the idea that the 1950s sees, much more a shift towards a more meritocratic society. By the 1960s, we're having new universities opening up, social and cultural changes, the working classes having a much more visible presence in Britain and in British popular culture. And the comics, in their way, I think, contribute to that movement.
It's interesting. It's funny that you used the word hard-bitten, because that was exactly the word I was going to use about, some hard-bitten, salt-of-the-earth Cockney coming up and cocking a snook to authority. When do comics start to bring in sort of, I'm thinking Roy of the Rovers here, because a lot of the comics can't just purely do war stories, and for you, Fritz, the war is over, etc.
Sports stories were perhaps the second most popular genre after war, and they've been there was a heritage of these going back before the Second World War. But I think again they enjoy their heyday. It's between the 1950s and 1970s. You mentioned Roy the Rovers, who must have had the longest professional football career. I lost count of the number of FA Cups or league titles that Melchester Rovers won, and I think sometimes they were in the European Cup. What's fascinating about those stories is that they always couch it within a sort of plausible framework. You never have this team being all-conquering, winning every single game. If they're having a good run in the Cup, they're usually struggling in the league and vice versa. So there's a certain amount of plausibility, although, Roy's exploits are spectacular. And he barely ages in what is it, 30 years of professional football. My favourite actually was a character called Alf Tupper
Right.
Who was a working class athlete and something of a social outsider. He had to contend with, coming from the wrong side of the tracks. He was often competing against the posh boys who had money and cars. He also had to hitchhike his way to athletics events. And he was a character who was started off in prose story papers, started off in a paper called The Rover, and later moved over into Victor. And basically, they just turned the old prose stories into picture strip stories. And Victor, which was a comic I took as a child, was I think it's perhaps more of a working class feel to it in terms of the stories and the kind of protagonists who are included there.
During the sort of the late 60s, early 70s, there is a bit of indignation, I suppose, or a bit of we talk about the moral crisis after which started with was the birth of the Eagle in deference. But during the late 60s, early 70s, the war comics tend to get a bit more violent and by the standards of the times. And it's, if you like, it's a reflection of, and I'm not going to get too deep in it, but the end of the 60s dream and the reality of the 70s. And then of course you get, if they thought that some of the war comics were getting a bit sort of anti-hero, suddenly out of nowhere, my favourite 2000 AD pops up, and that is extremely worrying for the moral conscience of the nation.
Yes, the 1970s is a period of quite a significant change for British comics. They go from promoting an ideology of consensus to embracing perhaps an even more oppositional stance. Certainly, there's an undercurrent to a lot of the stories and a shift towards a more anti-establishment ethos. The story behind 2000 AD, that it was launched in the expectation there's this minor little sci-fi B movie being made in Hollywood called Star Wars. And there are some rumours around it that it just might have a certain cult appeal. And so IPC, who were the leading British comic publisher by the 1970s, thought, we'll do a science fiction themed comic. It might last for 6 months, a year. We'll ride the back of this film, Star Wars, and then we'll see how it goes. And of course, Star Wars is a huge success and prompts a resurgence of space opera, of science fiction. 2000 AD sort of gets in there on the cusp of that. The first issue of 2000 AD prompted an editorial in The Guardian, accusing it of hawkish anti-Russian Cold War propaganda. There was a story about a Russian invasion of the British Isles.
I remember that one. I remember reading it, yes. And there's a couple of kids who fight
Bill
against,
Savage,
yes,
the Cockney truck driver who leads the resistance. They didn't actually call it the Soviet Union, but it was clearly meant to be the Soviet Union. From the second issue of 2000 AD, the flagship strip is Judge Dredd, the futuristic law enforcer of Mega City 1, and he's a very different character to Dan Dare. Whereas Dan had been this sort of wholesome, patriotic, chivalrous gentleman hero, Judge Dredd. Well, some have compared him to a sort of fascist enforcer. Yep. There's a future society where, social order is broken down, crime and violent crime is rife, and there's an elite group of lawmen known as the judges who dispense instant summary justice. And Judge Dredd became very popular, still is very popular. There's a strongly satirical element to it in my view, which I think undercuts some of the violence. But also, and I think we see this in other forms of popular culture as well, in science fiction, because it's a fantasy genre, because it's being projected into the future, because instinctively we know this is not a real world, it's possible to have more violence. Fantasy violence is acceptable even in comics for children in a way that realistic violence is not.
And you can go back to video games. I remember reading 2000 AD, and some of the stories, people get sliced and diced in ridiculous ways. I remember one about an aircraft landing on a foreign planet and half the people getting wiped out by plants and stuff. But when you're 7 years old, it's the same way as it used to do your action transfers. You should realise it's not real life. Can we just talk about because I've only got a minute left, but the artwork of things like 2000 AD, cutting edge, brilliant, and that new wave of British comic artists that have an influence on the graphic novels of today.
Yeah, it's writers like Pat Mills, artists like Brian Bolland, Dave Gibbons, who you go through to be part of the kind of comics renaissance in the 1980s and 1990s, where the sales of mass market comics decline, the juvenile readership, adolescent readership disappears, and comics now really are for adults. You go into a comic book store today, and the clientele are adults. 2000 AD grows up with its readers.
It does indeed. The book is called British Comics: A Cultural History. It's by James Chapman, who we're speaking to today. James, if people want to find you online, is there social media? Do you have a website, or is it just you just contact you through the publishers?
You can find me on the University of Leicester School of Arts, Media and Communication web pages.
Marvellous. The book is called British Comics. It's been such a pleasure to speak to you this morning. James Chapman, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Giles.